The crystal glasses clinked on our private yacht as my husband raised a toast to many more years together, unaware that I'd found evidence of his previous wives' disappearances at sea. When his eyes met mine, they widened in horror as the engines roared to life, with only me at the helm and his escape boat mysteriously missing. He thought tonight's anniversary cruise would be my last, but I had other plans. The last rays of Caribbean sunset painted our 40-foot yacht in shades of gold and crimson, waves gently lapping against the hull as we drifted further from St. Lucia's glittering coastline. Marcus stood at the bow, his athletic silhouette cut sharp against the darkening horizon as he poured the champagne, a vintage Krug we'd been saving since our wedding day. His hands moved with practiced grace, not a drop wasted. Always the perfectionist, my husband, especially when orchestrating someone's final moments. "You look breathtaking tonight," he smiled, handing me a crystal flute. The same smile that had charmed me at that charity gala in Manhattan 5 years ago. Now I saw it for what it was, a predator's mask, perfected through years of practice. His steel blue eyes sparkled with what guests at our dinner parties would call devotion. I knew better now. It was anticipation. The diamond-encrusted watch on his wrist caught the fading light as he raised his glass. His cherished family heirloom, or so he'd claimed when he'd given it to me last month. The same watch I'd seen glinting in photos of Rachel Anderson, wife number 2, on her final anniversary cruise in the Mediterranean, before she vanished without a trace, leaving behind a grieving husband and a recently updated life insurance policy. "To us, my darling." Marcus's voice carried that familiar warmth that once made my heart flutter. 5 perfect years, and to many more beautiful moments together. The irony in his words would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so deadly. I met his toast with practiced elegance, my own smile never wavering. The yacht's autopilot hummed beneath our feet, following the course I'd secretly programmed while Marcus was busy with his own preparations below deck. In his jacket pocket, I knew he carried what he thought would be his crowning achievement. A backdated life insurance policy worth $5 million. In my evening clutch lay something far more valuable, a USB drive containing proof of 3 wives' disappearances, each lost at sea during romantic anniversary celebrations, each wearing his cursed family heirlooms when they vanished. The champagne fizzed invitingly in my glass as I pretended to take a sip. From the corner of my eye, I caught the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight lean forward as he watched me drink. 5 years of marriage had taught me to read his tells, just as they'd taught him to read mine. Or so he thought. "You really outdid yourself this time," I said softly, watching him drain his glass with obvious satisfaction. "A private cruise, just the 2 of us, no witnesses for miles." I let my voice trail off suggestively, seeing the first flash of unease cross his features. "It reminds me of a story I read recently, about Rachel." The name landed like a depth charge in the growing darkness. Marcus's smile froze, a micro-expression of shock quickly masked by confusion. "Rachel?" "Rachel Anderson," I clarified, setting my untouched champagne aside. "Your second wife. She loved sailing too, didn't she? At least, according to the photos from her last anniversary cruise. She was wearing this exact watch." I tapped the diamond-encrusted band on my wrist. "Before she disappeared somewhere off the Amalfi coast." The engines thrummed louder as we moved further from shore, just as I'd planned. Marcus's perfect mask began to crack, confusion giving way to calculation as he processed my words. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, where I knew he kept the sedative, not just the insurance policy. Or perhaps we should discuss Catherine. Mills? Wife number 1, lost in a tragic yachting accident near the Maldives. Or Emma Chen, your 3rd tragic love, who vanished during a midnight cruise around Singapore. I kept my voice conversational, watching his face drain of color. They all had such excellent life insurance policies. Such tragic ends to their perfect marriages. Victoria, he started, his voice steady despite the growing panic in his eyes. You're not making any sense. The champagne must be getting to my head? I smiled, holding up my still full glass. Like it got to them? Or perhaps like it was supposed to get to me tonight? The yacht's horn blasted once, marking our arrival at the exact coordinates I'd chosen. Marcus spun around, finally noticing we weren't following his carefully plotted course. When he turned back to me, the mask was gone completely, replaced by something cold and calculating, and something that matched the expression I'd seen in his private photos, the ones he kept of each wife's final moments. You know, I said softly, reaching for the satellite phone he didn't know I'd already disabled. They say the perfect predator can become the prey, and you, my love, have been an excellent teacher. Sometimes love stories end in tragedy. Sometimes they end in justice. Tonight would be a perfect mix of both. Before we dive deeper into my tale of maritime deception and justice, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. If you're fascinated by stories of love turned lethal, of carefully planned revenge, and of justice served cold as the ocean depths, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's completely free, helps support these real-life narratives, and ensures you never miss an episode of Love, Lies, and Retribution. Now, let me take you back to where this story truly begins. Not on that moonlit yacht in the Caribbean, but 5 years earlier, in the glittering ballroom of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's where I first met Marcus Sterling, though back then, he was introducing himself as Marcus St. Clair. I would later learn he changed names as easily as he changed designer watches, each new identity crafted as carefully as the fate he planned for his wives. I was 32, newly promoted to senior, curator at the museum and organizing our annual winter gala. The event was exclusive, $5,000 a plate, guest list carefully curated to include only the city's most influential and wealthy. Looking back, I should have realized I was exactly what he was hunting for. Successful, independent, with a substantial trust fund I rarely touched. The perfect mark. That evening, I wore a vintage Dior gown, black velvet that whispered against the marble floors as I moved through the crowd, ensuring everything ran smoothly. The Egyptian wing had been transformed into something magical. Ancient sarcophagi and artifacts illuminated by thousands of twinkling lights, tables draped in midnight blue silk, centerpieces of white orchids and gold-dipped feathers. My career's crowning achievement, or so I thought at the time. I was checking the placement of the silent auction items when I felt his presence before I heard his voice. That's an interesting choice, he said, gesturing to the antique compass I'd been adjusting. Most people would have showcased the jewelry or artwork first, but you led with navigation instruments. When I turned, I found myself staring into those steel blue eyes for the first time. Marcus was devastating in a black Tom Ford tuxedo, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd just stepped off a yacht, which, I would learn later, was exactly the impression he cultivated. He held 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to me with a smile that seemed to suggest we shared a secret. The compass tells a better story, I replied, accepting the glass. It belonged to Isabella Cardenas, one of the first female shipping magnates in the Caribbean. She built an empire in a man's world, navigating both rough seas and rougher business deals. A woman after my own heart, he smiled, and I felt myself being drawn in despite my professional reserve. I have a particular fascination with maritime history myself, own a small collection of nautical antiquities. Looking back now, every word was calculated, every shared interest carefully researched. He'd studied me for months before that chance meeting, learned about my passion for historical artifacts, my love of the ocean passed down from my father, even my preference for vintage fashion. Each detail would be used to craft his perfect approach. The compass survived 3 shipwrecks, I continued, warming to the subject. They say Isabella used it to guide her ships through the worst storms in Caribbean history. Sometimes, Marcus said softly, his eyes never leaving mine, the most dangerous waters appear the calmest. Another warning I should have heeded, delivered, with perfect irony. The rest of that evening passed like a dream. Marcus was charming, knowledgeable, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. He asked thoughtful questions about the exhibits, shared fascinating stories about his supposed travels, and made me laugh with witty observations about the other guests. By the time he asked for my number, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our courtship was a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated coincidences. He'd send rare books about maritime history to my office, each one perfectly aligned with my interests. Weekend trips to coastal museums always seemed to end with romantic dinners overlooking the ocean. He knew exactly when to push and when to pull back, creating a perfect dance of pursuit and retreat that kept me intrigued. 1 month into dating, he took me sailing on what he claimed was his modest day cruiser, a 30-foot masterpiece of mahogany and brass. "There's something special about being on the water," he'd said, watching me trail my fingers through the waves. "It strips away all pretense, shows you who people really are." I remember thinking how poetic that sounded. Now I understand he was talking about fear, the kind that grips you when you're miles from shore, and realize the person at the helm isn't who they claimed to be, the kind his previous wives must have felt in their final moments. But that day, watching him expertly handle the sails, his strong hands confident on the wheel, I was falling into the same trap that had snared Rachel, Catherine, and Emma before me. Each of them successful, independent women who thought they'd found their perfect match. Each drawn in by his carefully crafted persona of the wealthy, sophisticated sailor with a passion for history and adventure. If only we'd had a way to share notes, to compare the stories he told each of us. But Marcus was too clever for that. Each relationship was compartmentalized, every detail managed with precision that would have impressed Isabella Cardenas herself. He never used the same approach twice, never left traces that could connect one identity to another. That would be his fatal mistake with me. Underestimating my passion for research, my obsession with historical detail, my ability to connect scattered pieces of evidence into a cohesive story. The very qualities that attracted him to me would ultimately lead to his undoing. But that night at the gala, watching him bid an obscene amount on the antique compass, just to see me smile, I was already caught in his web. The seeds of destruction were being sown in the most beautiful garden, and I, like the others before me, was too blinded by the flowers to see the thorns. After that first evening at the Met, Marcus's courtship was like watching a master artist at work. Each gesture, each surprise, each romantic moment was painted with precise strokes on the canvas of our budding relationship. Looking back now, I can appreciate the artistry of his deception, even as I marvel at my own blindness to the warning signs. Our first official date set the tone for everything that followed. He invited me to a private showing at Christie's auction house, a preview of their upcoming maritime antiquities collection. The timing was impeccable. He'd obviously done his research, knowing I'd been trying to acquire pieces for the museum's new nautical exhibition. The security guard greeted him by name, suggesting he was a regular patron, another carefully crafted detail in his elaborate performance. "I thought you might appreciate something more intimate than the usual dinner and drinks," he said, leading me through the dimly lit gallery. His hand rested lightly on the small of my back, confident but not presumptuous. "Beauty like this deserves undivided attention." The collection was breathtaking. Ancient navigational tools, ship's logs from the age of exploration, delicate scrimshaw pieces carved by lonely sailors at sea. Marcus knew the history of each piece, sharing fascinating details that even I, with my academic background, hadn't known. Now I wonder how many of those stories were true, how many were rehearsed for previous marks. We paused before a stunning ship's wheel, its brass fittings gleaming under the gallery lights. "From the Marina Elena," he explained, his voice taking on that passionate tone that made everything sound like a shared secret. "Lost off the coast of Bermuda in 1857. They say the captain's young wife was at the helm when a storm struck. She refused to abandon ship, went down still clutching the wheel." I shivered, despite the warmth of the gallery. "How tragic." "Not entirely," he smiled, moving closer. "They say she chose her fate. Better to embrace the ocean than live without the one she loved." His eyes met mine in the reflected glass, intense and searching. Some would call that romantic. Another warning sign I missed, his fascination with tragic maritime endings, with wives lost at sea. He wove these stories into our courtship like threads in a tapestry, each one a subtle hint of what he had planned. The evening ended with dinner at Le Bernardin. Not just any table, but the chef's table, with Eric Reipert himself stopping by, to greet Marcus like an old friend. Every detail was calculated to impress, to show wealth and influence without being ostentatious. I later learned he'd never dined there before. The entire scene was orchestrated through an expensive concierge service that specialized in creating authentic luxury experiences. Our relationship progressed with the same careful precision. Weekend sailing trips up the coast, each one pushing slightly further out to sea. He was teaching me to be comfortable on the water, he said, building my confidence. Really, he was, testing my reactions, noting my tolerance for different conditions, gathering data for his eventual plan. 3 weeks in, he surprised me with a private tour of the Coast Guard Museum in New London. As we walked through exhibits about famous rescues and tragic accidents, he kept steering the conversation toward stories of people lost at sea. "It's fascinating how many disappearances remain unsolved," he mused. "The ocean keeps its secrets." Well, that same weekend he introduced me to his supposed best friend, James Crawford, a successful maritime insurance broker who would later help process my life insurance application. James and his wife Claire played their parts perfectly, sharing stories about Marcus's childhood in Newport, his family's sailing legacy, his previous humanitarian work in coastal communities. All lies, all meticulously crafted and cross-referenced, so. "Should have seen him after his parents died," Claire said over dinner at their Southampton home. "Threw himself into charity work, helping families who'd lost loved ones at sea. That's just who he is, always turning personal tragedy into something meaningful." The fiction of Marcus's past was as carefully constructed as a ship in a bottle. Every detail in perfect miniature, beautiful but entirely artificial. His parents hadn't died in a yachting accident off Martha's Vineyard. They were very much alive in Ohio, where they'd raised the boy they knew as Michael Prescott. James wasn't his Harvard roommate turned best friend. He was a paid actor who specialized in providing background legitimacy for complex confidence schemes. But I absorbed every detail, every story, building my own picture of this wonderful man who seemed too good to be true. When he mentioned offshore accounts in the Caymans, I saw successful business acumen. When he insisted on handling all our sailing expeditions personally, I saw protective care. When he began casually mentioning insurance policies and joint accounts, I saw practical planning for our future. Each red flag was camouflaged by careful explanation, each potential warning sign disguised as thoughtful consideration. He was a master at turning suspicious behavior into apparent virtues. His reluctance to be photographed became endearing privacy. His insistence on handling all financial matters was framed as taking care of me. His careful documentation of our relationship, photos, emails, witness accounts, seemed like romantic devotion rather than the groundwork for my eventual accident. "You've awakened something in me," he said one night as we sat on his yacht watching the sunset over Long Island Sound. "I never thought I'd find someone who understands both worlds, the cultural and the nautical." His fingers traced patterns on my palm, a gesture I'd come to love. "Do you believe in fate, Victoria?" I did then. I believed in a lot of things. In the possibility of finding perfect love later in life, in the chance to blend my passion for history with his love of the sea. In the future he was so carefully painting for us. I couldn't see that he was really asking if I believed in tragic fates, in destinies that ended in dark waters and convenient insurance payouts. That evening, he presented me with an antique locket, silver, with intricate engravings of waves and stars. "It belonged to a ship captain's wife," he said, fastening it around my neck. "She wore it every day at sea, saying it would guide her safely home." I never learned if that story was true, or if the locket had belonged to Catherine, Rachel, or Emma. By the time I discovered his true nature, it had already been lost to the sea, like so many pieces of his elaborate deception, conveniently untraceable. Marcus's proposal came exactly 6 months after our first meeting, timed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Looking back, I realize everything about it was choreographed, from the location to the weather conditions, even down to the exact moment he went down on one knee. Like a master sailor reading the winds, he knew precisely when to make his move. The day began with a surprise delivery to my office at the museum. A vintage nautical map of the Caribbean, dated 1785, rolled inside an antique brass tube. The attached note read simply, "Time to chart a new course together. Meet me at the marina at sunset. M." The map, I would later learn, was genuine, probably purchased with money from his last wife's life insurance payout. I arrived at the marina to find his yacht, the Siren's Call, transformed. The deck was scattered with white rose petals, lanterns swaying gently in the evening breeze. Marcus stood at the helm, looking every inch the sophisticated sailor in, his cream linen suit and captain's cap. The image was perfect, too perfect, I now realize, like a scene staged for a magazine shoot. "I thought we'd take a special cruise to celebrate 6 amazing months," he said, helping me aboard with practiced grace. I noticed his hand trembled slightly. What I interpreted as nervous excitement was probably calculated acting. "I've planned something extraordinary." The yacht glided out of the harbor just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Marcus had arranged for a string quartet to play on the upper deck, another detail that should have seemed excessive, but somehow felt exactly right. They played softly as we sailed past the Statue of Liberty, the lights of Manhattan creating a glittering backdrop. "You know," he said, pouring champagne from a bottle that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, "sailors have always used the stars to guide them home." He pointed up at the first evening star appearing in the twilight sky. "But I never had a true north until I met you." The line was rehearsed, probably used before, but in that moment, it felt genuine. He led me to the bow, where a gourmet dinner waited under silver covers. Each course told a story: oysters from waters where we'd sailed together, lobster from the Maine coast where we'd spent our first weekend, wines from ports we'd discussed visiting. Between courses, he casually mentioned wanting to update his will, just being practical. He smiled, reaching for my hand. "When you find something precious, you want to protect it." Another warning sign disguised as romance, another piece of groundwork being laid. As dessert was served, a chocolate creation, designed to look like waves carrying a treasure chest, Marcus began telling me about his family's maritime history. Stories I now know were completely fabricated, borrowed from historical records and other people's lives. "My grandfather always said the sea gives us what we deserve," he mused, watching me carefully. "It takes what isn't meant to be and delivers what is." His voice took on that hypnotic quality that had first drawn me in at the museum. He proposed to my grandmother on a night just like this, under the same stars. Just then, the quartet began playing La Mer, and Marcus suggested we dance. As we swayed on the deck, the lights of the city twinkling behind us, he spun a beautiful tale about destiny and fate, Every word was calculated to resonate with my love of history and romance. "There's an old sailor's tradition," he said, leading me back to the bow. "They say if you make a wish at the exact moment the sun touches the horizon, the sea will grant it." He timed it perfectly. Just as the last sliver of sun disappeared, he dropped to one knee. The ring he presented was spectacular. An antique sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in platinum. "It belonged to a ship captain's wife in the 1920s, he explained as he slipped it onto my finger. "She crossed the Atlantic 17 times wearing this ring, saying it was her good luck charm." Another lie. The ring had actually belonged to Rachel, his second wife, though the original purchase receipt he'd forged listed it as coming from an exclusive antique jewelry dealer in London. "Victoria," he said, his voice thick with emotion that I now know was entirely manufactured. "You've changed my world, given me a reason to drop anchor, to build something lasting." He squeezed my hands, his blue eyes reflecting the gathering. "Starlight, will you marry me? Will you be my harbor in every storm?" Tears blurred my vision as I said yes. The quartet struck up Pachelbel's canon, and crew members, all hired actors, I later discovered, appeared with more champagne. The entire scene was orchestrated for maximum emotional impact, designed to create a memory so perfect I would never question it. Later that night, as we sailed back to the marina, Marcus pointed out various constellations, weaving them into metaphors for our future together. "Like stars in the night sky," he said, "some things are written in fate." He wasn't talking about love. He was talking about my intended destiny, already planned and plotted like a navigator's course. We celebrated at the marina's exclusive restaurant, where the staff greeted Marcus by name and, coincidentally, had our favorite table ready. The other diners, I later realized, included James and Claire, strategically seated to witness our engagement and provide future testimony about our perfect relationship. "To new horizons," Marcus toasted, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "To adventures yet to come." Each word had a double meaning I couldn't yet understand. As we clinked glasses, his signet ring caught the light, another family heirloom that had probably been worn by a previous wife. Looking back, I wish I'd noticed how he immediately began taking photos of us together, documenting our happiness. How he insisted on sending engagement announcements to specific newspapers, creating a paper trail. How he casually mentioned increasing my life insurance coverage now that we're family. But I was too captivated by the fairy tale he'd crafted, too enchanted by the perfect proposal story we'd share with our future children. I didn't realize I was just the latest character in a tragedy he'd performed before, each act building toward a finale that would end with another mysterious disappearance. At sea, the diamond on my finger caught the candlelight, throwing sparkles across the table. "It's like it was made for you," Marcus said softly, watching me admire it. If only I'd known then that the same ring had been made for another woman, who now lay somewhere in the cold depths of the Mediterranean, her death classified as a tragic sailing accident. Our wedding was the talk of Newport's social season, a lavish affair that combined maritime elegance with old-world sophistication. Marcus chose the venue, of course, the iconic Castle Hill Inn, perched on the cliffs, overlooking the Atlantic. The ceremony was set for sunset, with the lighthouse providing a perfectly romantic backdrop. Every detail reinforced his carefully crafted image as the wealthy sailing enthusiast with impeccable taste. The guest list read like a who's who of the yachting world, though I'd later discover most were hired actors or paid acquaintances. Marcus had an entire false life constructed, complete with prep school friends, business partners, and distant relatives, all briefed and compensated to maintain his elaborate facade. "You look absolutely radiant," Claire gushed as she helped me with my veil, a delicate antique lace that Marcus claimed had belonged to his grandmother. Like everything else about him, it came with a romantic story. His grandmother had worn it while eloping with his grandfather on a midnight sailing trip to Nantucket. In reality, it had probably belonged to Catherine, wife number 1, though I wouldn't discover that until much later. The wedding march began, and I walked down the aisle scattered with sea glass and white rose petals. Marcus waited at the altar, resplendent in his white naval-style dinner jacket, tears glistening in his eyes. Such a convincing performance, he'd probably practiced those tears in the mirror, just as he'd practiced every gesture and expression that made him appear the perfect, devoted husband. Our vows were exchanged as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden light catching the sapphire ring that felt so heavy on my finger. Like the tide returning to shore, Marcus promised, his voice carrying across the hushed, gathering, "I will always come back to you." Another line recycled from previous performances, though I didn't know it then. The reception was a masterpiece of nautical elegance. Tables were named after famous lighthouses, centerpieces featured antique compasses and crystal ships and bottles. Marcus had commissioned a massive ice sculpture of a schooner under full sail, its frozen form slowly melting as the evening progressed, a rather poetic metaphor for our marriage looking back. We danced our first dance to Beyond the Sea, Marcus, guiding me across the floor with the same confident grace he showed at the helm of his yacht. Guests commented on how perfect we looked together, how we moved as one. We'd practiced, of course. Marcus insisted on dance lessons, not because he needed them, but because it gave him another opportunity to document our relationship. Photos, videos, witness accounts, all evidence of our perfect love, all groundwork for what he planned to follow. The honeymoon was a month-long sailing trip through the Greek islands, each destination more romantic than the last. Marcus knew every hidden cove, every secluded beach, every intimate taverna. Now I wonder how many of those same spots he'd visited with his previous wives, how many times he'd practiced this same romantic journey. "Look at that color," he'd say, pointing to the deep blue of the Mediterranean. "They call it wine-dark sea. Homer wrote about it in the Odyssey." He was always teaching, always sharing fascinating details that made every moment feel special. "Did you know more people have disappeared in these waters than anywhere else in Europe?" These casual mentions of maritime disappearances were sprinkled throughout our conversations, so subtle I barely noticed them. Like salt in a perfect dish, they enhanced the flavor of his deception without drawing attention to themselves. Our first year of marriage was a carefully choreographed dance of domestic bliss and adventurous sailing. Marcus was the perfect husband, attentive, thoughtful, romantic. He brought me coffee in bed every morning, remembered every anniversary, monthly then yearly, and surprised me with thoughtful gifts that always seemed to align perfectly with my interests. Our social life revolved around the yachting community, with weekend regattas and charity sailing events filling our calendar. Marcus was Commodore of the Yacht Club, a position secured through generous donations and carefully cultivated relationships. And I threw myself into the role of the perfect Commodore's wife. We hosted dinner parties on our yacht, organized fundraisers for marine conservation, and built a reputation as the golden couple of the maritime set. "You two are just perfect together," our friends would say, watching us navigate both social events and rough seas with apparent ease. "Like you were meant to find each other." If they only knew how carefully Marcus had engineered that finding, how meticulously he'd planned every aspect of our meant-to-be romance. He encouraged my career at the museum, always supporting my ambitious projects and connections to the art world. But he also began suggesting I cut back on my hours, citing concern for my health and our desire to start a family. "You work too hard, darling," he'd say, massaging my shoulders as I reviewed acquisition proposals. "Let me take care of everything." Slowly, subtly, he began taking over more aspects of our life together. Financial decisions, social arrangements, travel plans, all fell under his control, always presented as him shouldering burdens to make my life easier. He added his name to my accounts, consolidated our assets, and began moving funds offshore. All standard estate planning, he assured me. Our second anniversary brought another spectacular surprise. A custom-designed emerald and diamond necklace that he claimed was inspired by seafoam and starlight. "Every beautiful thing reminds me of you," he said, fastening it around my neck. The clasp was unusual, complicated, designed, I now realize, to be difficult to remove quickly if one found oneself unexpectedly in the water. That same anniversary, he increased both our life insurance policies. "Just being prudent," he explained, "over champagne and oysters. The sea can be unpredictable." His eyes held mine across the candlelit table, searching for any sign of suspicion. But I was still blind, still believing in the perfect life he'd constructed. We celebrated 3 years together with a midnight cruise, just the two of us. Marcus pointed out constellations, telling ancient tales of sailors guided home by the stars. "Some say the stars know our fate," he mused, his arm around my waist as we stood at the bow. "That our destiny is written in their patterns." He was marking time, I realize now. Each perfect moment, each romantic gesture, each carefully documented celebration was another piece of evidence building toward his ultimate plan. Like a captain plotting a long journey, he knew exactly where each step would lead. But even the most skilled navigator can't account for every variable. And as our 4th anniversary approached, bringing with it his increasingly frequent business trips and subtle tests of my sailing abilities, fate had other plans. The hunter was about to become the hunted, though neither of us knew it yet. The truth began unraveling on a stormy Tuesday in March, 4 years and 7 months into our marriage. Marcus was away on another of his frequent business trips, this one supposedly to oversee a yacht purchase in Monaco. The irony doesn't escape me now. While he was likely scouting locations for my planned disappearance, I was about to discover the evidence of his previous crimes. I'd taken advantage of his absence to organize his private study, something he subtly discouraged, always citing respect for his workspace and confidential business documents. The room was a testament to his carefully crafted persona. Antique nautical charts adorned the walls. Model ships in glass cases caught the gray light from rain-streaked windows, and his prized collection of maritime instruments gleamed from custom-built shelves. The discovery came by accident, or perhaps fate finally turned the tide in my favor. I was examining his antique captain's desk, admiring the intricate inlay work, when my elbow knocked against a hidden lever. The smooth click of a releasing mechanism froze me in place. In all our years of marriage, I'd never known the desk contained secret compartments. My hands trembled as I located the concealed panel, years of handling delicate artifacts giving me the precision needed to trigger the hidden catch without damaging the antique wood. The false bottom slid away with the whisper of well-oiled hinges revealing a space that shouldn't have existed. Inside lay a burgundy leather portfolio, its surface unmarked except for a small anchor symbol embossed in gold. Next to it, a collection of USB drives labeled with dates and initials, KM, RA, EC. My curatorial instincts took over as I carefully lifted each item, photographing their exact positions before removing them. Little did I know I was documenting evidence that would eventually save my life. The portfolio contained what looked like insurance documents at first glance. But as I began reading, the elegant room around me seemed to fade away, replaced by a growing horror. Policy after policy, each worth millions, each naming Marcus as the sole beneficiary. But the names on these policies weren't his. They belonged to Catherine Mills, Rachel Anderson, and Emma Chen. My hands shook as I connected my laptop to the first USB drive. Folders appeared, meticulously organized with the same precision Marcus showed in everything he did. The first contained photographs, hundreds of them, documenting a relationship that mirrored my own. Catherine Mills, a successful gallery owner from Boston, smiled at the camera from the deck of a yacht. She wore my sapphire engagement ring. The next folder held newspaper clippings. Tragic disappearance in Maldives waters. Search continues for missing art dealer. Hope fades as rescue efforts scale back. Each article told the same story. A tragic accident at sea, a grieving husband, a body never recovered. Rachel Anderson's drive revealed a similar pattern. A beautiful corporate lawyer from Seattle, she'd disappeared during an anniversary cruise off the Amalfi Coast. She wore my emerald necklace in her engagement photos. The insurance payout had been substantial, the investigation brief and inconclusive. Emma Chen's story was more recent. A Hong Kong investment banker, she'd vanished during a midnight sail near Singapore just 18 months before I met Marcus. Her photos showed her wearing the antique locket he'd given me our first Christmas together. The room spun as pieces clicked into place. His insistence on handling all our financial matters. The careful documentation of our relationship. The subtle pressure to update my will. The vitamin supplements he'd started adding to my evening tea, coinciding with my increasing fatigue these past weeks. Rain drummed against the study windows as I sank into his leather chair, the weight of truth crushing against my chest. The perfect husband, the romantic sailor, the sophisticated collector, all carefully constructed masks hiding a predator who hunted wealthy women with the same precision he used to navigate treacherous waters. My laptop chimed with an incoming email. Marcus, checking in from Monaco. Missing you, darling. The yacht is perfect. Can't wait to surprise you with it for our anniversary. Just a few more details to arrange. I stared at his words, seeing them for what they really were. Not loving communication, but updates on the progress of my planned demise. The yacht would be the setting for my accident, carefully chosen and prepared, just as he'd done 3 times before. Moving on autopilot, I began copying files. My museum training serving me well as I documented everything methodically. Each photo, each document, each piece of evidence was carefully duplicated and secured. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, knowing my survival depended on maintaining the illusion of ignorance. That night, as thunder rolled across the harbor, I lay in our bed planning my own counter-strategy. Marcus had spent years teaching me about sailing, about navigation, about reading weather patterns and ocean currents. He'd educated me in the art of plotting courses and calculating risks. Now I would use those very skills against him. I knew I couldn't go to the police, not yet. The evidence was circumstantial, the previous investigations already closed. Marcus had too many connections, too many carefully planted witnesses who would testify to his devotion and grief. No, this would require a different approach. Like a captain preparing for a hurricane, I began battening down the hatches of my own survival. First, I needed to confirm my suspicions about the tea. A sample sent to a private lab confirmed the presence of a sophisticated compound, untraceable in small doses but lethal when administered over time. Next came the task of building my immunity while maintaining the appearance of deteriorating health. Each night, I disposed of his special tea when he wasn't looking, replacing it with my own brew laced with carefully measured doses of the compound I'd identified. The side effects were brutal: nausea, dizziness, crushing fatigue, but each day made me stronger, more resistant. I hired a private investigator, Sandra Pierce, under the guise of researching a potential museum donor. She was thorough, discreet, and most importantly, female, someone Marcus would never suspect. Within weeks, she uncovered more than I could have imagined. His business trips weren't just covers for planning my demise, they were reconnaissance missions, scouting locations, and establishing alibis. The pieces of his plan became clear: a romantic anniversary cruise, a tragic accident at sea, a grieving husband left to collect millions in insurance money. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd chosen a victim whose entire career was built on researching and preserving historical artifacts. I knew how to reconstruct stories from fragments, how to piece together narratives from scattered evidence. As lightning illuminated the harbor that stormy night, I made my decision. Marcus had spent years teaching me about the sea, about reading weather and waves. Now I would show him how well I'd learned those lessons. The hunter was about to become the hunted, though he didn't know it yet. Sometimes the most dangerous waters are the ones that appear the calmest. Marcus had taught me that, among so many other things. Now it was time to show him just how well his lessons had taken root. The next 3 months became my own carefully orchestrated performance. Like a skilled navigator plotting a course through treacherous waters, I mapped out every detail of my counter-strategy. Marcus had taught me well, perhaps too well, about the importance of meticulous planning and attention to detail. My first move was to establish my own secure base of operations. The museum's conservation lab became my sanctuary, its climate-controlled environment perfect for both preserving artifacts and conducting my own research without arousing suspicion. I started staying late, claiming a major restoration project needed my attention. Marcus encouraged this, probably seeing it as another sign of my declining energy and focus. "You're working too hard, darling," he'd say, massaging my shoulders, with what I now recognized as calculated concern. "Perhaps it's time to consider stepping back." Each suggestion was a test, monitoring my compliance with his larger plan. I used these late nights to compile evidence, creating 3 separate digital archives of everything I'd discovered. One went to a safety deposit box in Boston under my grandmother's maiden name. Another was encrypted and stored on a secure server in Switzerland. The third I entrusted to Sandra Pierce, my private investigator, with instructions to release it to authorities if anything happened to me. Sandra proved invaluable, her expertise in maritime insurance fraud opening doors I hadn't known existed. She discovered Marcus had a pattern of purchasing boats through shell companies, each vessel becoming the stage for his elaborate performances. "He's methodical," she reported during one of our clandestine meetings at a small coffee shop in Providence. "Each boat is bought clean, used for one accident, then sold through a different shell company. The paperwork is always perfect, but the ownership trails lead nowhere." She'd traced his activities back further than I'd initially discovered. Before Catherine Mills, there had been 2 other wives, Sarah Blackwood and Jennifer Torres. Both lost at sea, both cases closed as tragic accidents. Both insurance policies paid out to beneficiaries who disappeared shortly after. "He's refined his technique over time," Sandra explained, showing me timeline charts that mapped his evolution. The early disappearances were rougher, less sophisticated, but by Catherine Mills, he'd developed his signature style. While Sandra tracked his past, I focused on understanding his methods. I took advanced sailing courses under an assumed name, learning everything about emergency procedures and survival techniques. I studied maritime weather patterns, radio protocols, and navigation systems. Every piece of knowledge became a potential tool for survival. The hardest part was maintaining my role as the devoted wife while building my resistance to his poison. Each morning, I'd prepare 2 sets of tea, his regular blend and my own, carefully dosed with increasing amounts of the compound I'd identified. The side effects were brutal. I spent countless nights hunched over the toilet, my body fighting against the toxin even as it developed immunity. To cover these episodes, I started a wellness journal, documenting my supposed declining health. Marcus read every entry, his concerned frowns masking satisfaction as my symptoms matched his expectations. I caught him photographing me during particularly rough moments, adding to his collection of evidence for the inevitable investigation. "Perhaps we should consult another specialist," he'd suggest, knowing the doctors he'd chosen would find nothing concrete. "I hate seeing you like this." His performance was flawless, the devoted husband watching his wife's mysterious illness progress exactly as planned. Meanwhile, I began laying my own groundwork. I cultivated relationships with key maritime authorities, using my museum connections to build networks that would prove crucial later. I studied the investigation reports from his previous wives' disappearances, noting the patterns and learning from their attempts at survival. One discovery particularly chilled me. Each of his victims had suspected something was wrong. I found hidden notes, encrypted emails, and subtle signs that they'd begun to piece things together. But they'd waited too long, tried to gather too much evidence, or confronted him too soon. Their mistakes became my lessons. I also started making strategic financial moves, careful to keep them below Marcus's radar. Small transfers to accounts he couldn't trace, investments in my own name, preparations for a future he didn't plan to let me have. Sandra helped me establish offshore accounts mirroring his own. What better place to hide than in plain sight? The most crucial preparation involved the yacht itself. During Marcus's frequent business trips, I made my own modifications to the vessel he'd chosen for my demise. Hidden cameras in the cabin, backup GPS trackers, emergency equipment stashed where he'd never think to look. Every addition was carefully concealed, every change designed to appear completely natural. I studied the weather patterns for the area where he'd likely stage my accident, learning to read the signs of approaching storms and understanding how they could be used to my advantage. The sea itself would become my ally, its movements and moods weapons in my arsenal. As our anniversary approached, I watched Marcus's excitement grow. He spent hours in his study, finalizing details and making mysterious phone calls. Each preparation he made, I countered with one of my own. When he installed new navigation equipment, I added my own backup systems. When he scheduled maintenance checks, I had my own expert examine the boat afterward. "Everything needs to be perfect for our anniversary cruise," he'd say, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "I want this to be unforgettable." On that point, at least, we agreed. The most dangerous moment came when he nearly discovered my investigation. I'd left an encrypted file open on my laptop, hidden behind museum documentation. Marcus came to bring me lunch at the conservation lab, moving faster than I'd expected. "What's that you're working on?" he asked, approaching my desk. Years of handling priceless artifacts under pressure had taught me to move smoothly even in crisis. I switched screens without missing a beat, bringing up a restoration report. "Just cataloging damage patterns on maritime artifacts," I smiled, pointing to a corroded brass compass. "It's fascinating how salt water affects different materials." He leaned in, interested despite himself, and I launched into a detailed explanation of conservation techniques that I knew would bore him away from further questions. That night, I added another layer of security to my research, creating additional fail-safes and backup plans. Like a ship preparing for heavy weather, I needed every system checked and double-checked. There would be no second chances once our final voyage began. As I worked, I thought about his previous wives, Catherine, Rachel, Emma, and the others. Their faces haunted my research, their stories driving me forward. They had been brilliant, capable women, each with their own dreams and achievements. Their only mistake was trusting a man who had turned love into a weapon. "The sea keeps its secrets," Marcus liked to say. But I was determined this time would be different. This time, the truth would surface, and justice would finally catch up, with the man who thought he could master both love and the ocean itself. The week before our anniversary arrived with the inevitability of an approaching storm. Marcus's excitement was palpable, manifesting in small gestures that once would have seemed romantic, but now carried sinister undertones. Fresh flowers appeared daily in every room of our waterfront home. Lilies, my favorite, their sweet scent, mingling with the salt air. Like flowers at a funeral, I thought, watching him arrange them with precise care. He'd chosen our anniversary cruise route months ago, plotting a course through what he called the most beautiful waters in the Caribbean. The journey would take us past several small private islands, far from regular shipping lanes and curious eyes. "Perfect for a romantic getaway," he said. "Perfect for an accident, I knew." "I've arranged everything," he announced over dinner 3 nights before our departure. "Private chef for the first night, satellite phone for emergencies, all the proper permits." His eyes sparkled with anticipation as he topped off my wine glass. "Nothing but open water and starlit skies for 5 whole days." I smiled, playing my part in this deadly choreography. "It sounds perfect," I said, watching him sip his wine. "Absolutely unforgettable." The double meaning in my words went right past him, his confidence in his plan making him blind to the danger sitting across the table. The yacht itself, a stunning 48-foot luxury cruiser, had become our shared obsession, for different reasons. Marcus spent hours checking and rechecking systems, ensuring everything would function exactly as planned. What he didn't know was that I'd made my own modifications during his frequent business trips. Hidden cameras now monitored every crucial area of the boat, their feeds broadcasting to secure servers that Sandra could access. Emergency locator beacons were concealed in seemingly decorative additions to the cabin. I'd even managed to install a backup satellite communication system, disguised as an upgraded entertainment unit. "The navigation system is state-of-the-art," Marcus boasted during our final inspection. "It can practically sail itself." He demonstrated the autopilot features, not realizing I'd already memorized every detail of the system and installed my own override controls. The night before our departure, I made one final visit to the conservation lab. Under the guise of completing urgent work, I met with Sandra to review our contingency plans. "Everything's in place," she confirmed, showing me the tracking systems on her laptop. "The moment anything deviates from normal parameters, I'll have Coast Guard vessels moving to these coordinates." She pointed to strategic positions along our planned route. "And the evidence?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sandra was nothing if not thorough. Multiple copies secured and ready. "For distribution, the moment I get your signal, or if I don't hear from you at the scheduled check-ins, everything goes to authorities in 3 countries." She squeezed my hand. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? We could stop him now." I shook my head, watching the harbor lights reflect off the lab's windows. "He's too careful. Without catching him in the act, it would be his word against circumstantial evidence. He'd find a way to escape, and another woman would end up at the bottom of the ocean." Back home, I found Marcus in his study, making final adjustments to what he called our anniversary surprise. Through the partially open door, I watched him check a small vial, holding it up to the light before carefully packing it in his medical kit. The sight should have terrified me, but I felt oddly calm. Like a sailor who has prepared for every possible storm condition, I knew my survival equipment was ready. That night, as we lay in bed, Marcus pulled me close, kissing my temple with practiced tenderness. "I can't wait to have you all to myself," he murmured. "Just us and the open sea." His hand traced patterns on my arm, and I wondered if he'd done this with the others, offered them one last night of false comfort before their final voyage. "Tell me again about the route," I said softly, playing into his ego's need to showcase his planning. As he described the course he'd plotted, I mentally reviewed my own preparations. The series of small islands we'd pass would provide crucial landmarks for the Coast Guard. The deep waters he'd chosen for their privacy would work equally well for my purposes. Morning arrived with perfect sailing weather, clear skies, steady winds, and calm seas. Marcus was up early, supervising the loading of supplies onto the yacht. I watched from our bedroom window as he directed the crew with military precision, each item carefully stored according to his plan. My own supplies had been smuggled aboard over the past week, equipment and evidence hidden in innocent-looking luggage and decorative items. The yacht's master cabin now contained enough surveillance equipment to document every moment of our journey, though none of it was visible to the casual observer. "Ready for our adventure?" Marcus called up, waving from the dock. "The morning," Son caught his signet ring, another family heirloom that had probably belonged to a previous wife. Just finishing my packing, I called back, forcing excitement into my voice. In truth, my preparations had been complete for days. The small bag I carried now contained only what I needed for the next few hours: documents, emergency equipment, and my own carefully prepared supplies. As I made my final checks around the house, I paused in front of our wedding photo. We looked so happy, so in love. Me in my white dress, Marcus in his captain's dinner jacket, both of us framed against the setting sun. The perfect couple, everyone had said. If they only knew they were looking at predator and prey, locked in. An elaborate dance of deception. I took one last look around the home we'd shared, knowing that regardless of how the next few days played out, I would never return here. Either Marcus's plan would succeed, adding my name to his list of tragic accidents, or mine would work, and this house would become a crime scene. "The tide's perfect," Marcus called from outside. "Time to cast off." I squared my shoulders, checked my reflection one last time, and picked up my bag. Like an actress preparing for her greatest role, I took a deep breath and stepped out into the sunshine. The stage was set, the players were ready, and our final performance was about to begin. As I walked down to the dock, I thought about Catherine, Rachel, Emma, and the others. They had trusted and loved him too, planned futures with him, never suspecting their anniversaries would end in tragedy. But I had something they didn't, the advantage of knowing exactly what kind of monster wore the mask of my perfect husband. Marcus held out his hand to help me aboard, every inch the attentive spouse. "Ready to make some memories, darling?" I took his hand, smiling up at him with practiced adoration. "Absolutely. This is one anniversary we'll never forget." On that point, at least, we were in perfect agreement. The first day of our anniversary cruise played out exactly as Marcus had scripted. We sailed through crystal-clear waters, the private chef prepared an exquisite lunch, and my husband performed the role of devoted spouse to perfection. As the sun began to set, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of amber and rose, I watched him calculating distances and checking his watch with increasing frequency. "Wine, darling?" Marcus held up a bottle of Chateau Margaux 2015, the same vintage we'd shared at our wedding. "I've been saving this for a special occasion." His hands moved with practiced grace as he uncorked the bottle, but I caught the slight tremor of anticipation in his fingers. "How thoughtful," I smiled, accepting the glass he offered. "You always remember the perfect details." Like the exact depth of these waters, I thought. Like the distance to the nearest shipping lane. Like the time it would take for evidence to disappear in the Caribbean currents. We stood at the stern, watching the wake trail behind us like a silver ribbon in the fading light. The autopilot hummed softly, keeping us on the precise course Marcus had programmed. Or so he thought. "Remember our first sailing trip together?" he asked, moving closer. "You were so nervous about being far from shore." His arm slipped around my waist, a gesture that once brought comfort but now felt like a predator's grasp. "You taught me so much about the sea," I replied, letting nostalgia color my voice. "About reading the waters, understanding the currents. About how bodies disappear in deep waters, leaving no trace. About how accidents happen in the most remote locations. The yacht's engines changed pitch slightly, a signal I'd been waiting for. We'd reached the exact coordinates I'd chosen for our confrontation, far enough from shipping lanes to ensure privacy, but well within range of the emergency systems I'd put in place. "You know," I continued casually, "I've always wondered about something." I turned to face him, noting how the sunset caught the eager gleam in his eyes. Did Catherine prefer red wine too? Or Rachel? What about Emma? The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. A microflash of shock quickly masked by confusion. Victoria, what are you talking about? Your previous wives, darling. I took a deliberate sip of wine. The ones who had tragic accidents at sea. The ones whose life insurance policies made you a very wealthy man. His recovery was impressive, almost instantaneous. You're not making sense, sweetheart. The heat must be getting to you. He reached for my glass. Perhaps you should lie down. Stepped back, maintaining my distance. I found your secret compartment, Marcus. The portfolio, the USB drives, all of it. Did you use the same desk to store mementos from all your wives, or am I special? The mask slipped completely then, his handsome features hardening into something cold and predatory. When? Does it matter? I watched him process this new information, his mind already calculating adjustments to his plan. 3 months ago, plenty of time to prepare for this moment. His laugh held no humor. Prepare? For what? Even if what you're suggesting were true, we're miles from shore. No witnesses, no evidence. Just a tragic accident waiting to happen. His hand moved toward his pocket where I knew he kept the vial of poison. Like Rachel's accident off the Amalfi Coast, or Emma's mysterious disappearance near Singapore. I pulled out my phone, showing him the tracking app. Every moment of this cruise is being monitored, every word recorded. Right now, authorities in 3 countries are receiving evidence of your previous murders. Circumstantial evidence, he scoffed, but I saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Your word against mine, and dead women tell no tales. But their stories do. I pressed another button on my phone, and the yacht's hidden speakers came to life with his own voice. Recordings of phone calls, conversations about insurance policies, arrangements for accidents at sea. I've spent months gathering every detail, every connection, every piece of evidence you thought was safely hidden. Marcus moved with the speed of a striking snake, but I was ready. As he lunged for me, I triggered the yacht's emergency protocols, or protocols I'd modified myself. The engines cut out, emergency lights flashed, and the cabin doors sealed automatically. What did you do? He snarled, grabbing my arm. What did you do to my boat? Your boat? I laughed, twisting free with a move I'd practiced countless times. Check the registration, darling. I had it transferred to my name last month. Another detail you missed while planning my death. He rushed to the navigation console, frantically trying to override the systems. Nothing responded to his commands. How? You taught me well, I said, keeping my distance. About sailing, about planning, about paying attention to every detail. Did you really think I spent all those late nights at the museum? I was learning, Marcus. Learning everything about you, your methods, your previous victims. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the evening air. Marcus's head snapped up, watching as Coast Guard aircraft appeared on the horizon. It's not possible, he whispered. The route was perfect. The timing was exactly what I wanted it to be, I finished for him. Every coordinate, every course adjustment, all planned to bring us to this exact spot at this exact moment. Patrol boats appeared in the distance, their lights cutting through the gathering dusk. Marcus looked from them to me, his perfect composure finally cracking completely. You know what your mistake was? I asked, watching him realize how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. You spent so much time teaching me about the sea, about reading weather and waves, about planning the perfect voyage. But you forgot one crucial lesson. What's that? He spat, his handsome features twisted with rage. Sometimes the prey learns to hunt. I held up my still full wine glass. By the way, I switched our glasses when you were checking the navigation system. The poison you've been drinking for the last hour? I've spent months building immunity to it. His face drained of color as the implications hit him. His legs buckled, and he grabbed the railing for support. Me, I agreed, watching him slide to the deck. The perfect student, just like you wanted. though I doubt this is the anniversary surprise you had in mind. The patrol boats were close now, their searchlights illuminating the yacht's deck. Marcus tried to stand but couldn't, the poison he'd intended for me finally taking full effect. "The sea keeps its secrets," I said softly, using his favorite phrase. "But not this time. This time, everything comes to the surface." As the authorities boarded our yacht, I thought about Catherine, Rachel, Emma, and all the others. Finally, their stories would be told. Finally, justice would be served. And Marcus would learn his final lesson, that sometimes the most dangerous waters are the ones that appear the calmest. The Coast Guard's floodlights turned night into day as they secured the yacht. Marcus lay slumped against the railing, his perfectly tailored linen suit now wrinkled and damp with sweat. The poison, his own carefully chosen weapon, had left him conscious but paralyzed, forced to watch as his meticulously constructed world crumbled around him. "Mrs. Sterling," a Coast Guard officer approached, her uniform crisp despite the humid night air. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes. We received your signal and the evidence packets. Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," I assured her, handing over my untouched wine glass. "You'll want to test this, and there's a vial in his left jacket pocket, the original source of the compound." Medical personnel swarmed the deck, checking Marcus's vital signs while maintaining security protocols. I watched with detached fascination as they efficiently collected evidence: the wine glasses, the bottle, the navigation logs, everything I'd carefully documented over the past 3 months. "The antidote," Marcus managed to croak, his eyes locked on mine. "You'll need it soon." I smiled, almost pitying his final attempt at manipulation. "No antidote needed," I replied, showing him the small vial I'd kept concealed. "I've been building immunity to your poison for months. Another detail you missed. While planning my demise." The look of comprehension that crossed his face was almost worth everything I'd endured. Almost. Sandra Pierce arrived on the second Coast Guard vessel, laptop in hand and looking remarkably unaffected by the sea spray. "Everything transmitted perfectly," she reported, showing me the streams of data from the yacht's hidden cameras. "All evidence secure and distributed to multiple agencies." As if to confirm her words, my phone buzzed with messages from law enforcement, agencies in 3 countries. The cases of Catherine, Rachel, and Emma were being reopened. Marcus's carefully buried past was surfacing like a corpse in rough waters. "We found the emergency raft," another officer reported, emerging from below. "Tech. Hidden compartment, just like you said, fully stocked with survival gear, fresh water, and..." He checked his notes. "Approximately 5 million in bearer bonds." I nodded, remembering how I'd discovered Marcus's escape plan hidden in his encrypted files. He'd intended to stage my accident, deploy the life raft in the confusion, and disappear. With the insurance money while search teams looked for my body in the wrong location. "The navigation system shows 2 programmed courses," a technical officer added. "One registered in the main computer, another hidden in the backup system." He looked at Marcus with professional disgust. "The second route leads straight into a notorious section of rough water. Perfect place for an accident." Marcus remained silent, but his eyes burned with fury as each piece of evidence was cataloged and documented. The perfect predator, finally caught in a trap of his own making. Lieutenant Commander Hayes supervised as her team photographed and secured everything. "We'll need your full statement," she told me. "But the preliminary evidence matches everything you provided. Multiple jurisdictions are already coordinating on the previous cases." I watched as they helped Marcus to his feet, securing him despite his weakened state. The poison would wear off in a few hours. I'd calculated the dose carefully, just as he'd taught me about maritime navigation. Enough to incapacitate, not to kill. Death would have been too easy. "You destroyed everything," he managed to say as they led him past me. "Years of perfect planning, ruined." "No, Marcus. I just learned from the best." I held up my hand, showing him the diamond-encrusted watch he'd given me, the one I'd seen in photos of Rachel. You taught me about patience, about attention to detail, about waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I was an excellent student. The yacht's deck lights cast strange shadows as the evidence collection continued. Teams documented every inch of the vessel, finding the hidden cameras I'd installed, the backup communication systems, the carefully concealed evidence of Marcus's previous crimes. Sandra joined me at the railing, watching the process. The families have been notified, she said quietly. Catherine's sister couldn't stop crying. They'd never believed the accident story. I thought about those other women, successful, intelligent, accomplished in their own fields. Each had fallen for Marcus's perfect performance just as I had. But their stories wouldn't end in tragedy this time. Their tales would help ensure justice was served. The night air carried the smell of salt and justice as Marcus was transferred to the larger Coast Guard vessel. His perfect white suit was ruined, his carefully styled hair disheveled. The mask of sophistication had crumbled completely, revealing the predator beneath. The currents are changing, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. Marcus had taught me about ocean currents, about how they could carry secrets away forever. But sometimes they brought things back to the surface, revealing what was meant to stay hidden. Teams continued to process the yacht, each discovery adding to the mountain of evidence. They found the fake documentation he'd prepared to explain my accident, the backdated insurance policies, the carefully crafted letters, expressing concern about my health. We found something else, an officer reported, holding up a waterproof case. Inside lay photographs, dozens of them, showing women I didn't recognize. There may be more victims we didn't know about. I wasn't surprised. Like the ocean itself, Marcus's crimes ran deeper than anyone had suspected. But unlike the sea, he wouldn't keep his secrets anymore. The horizon was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking over the water. I watched as the Coast Guard vessels prepared to escort us back to port, their lights reflecting off the gentle waves. The perfect night for sailing was becoming the perfect morning for justice. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Catherine's sister. A simple thank you that carried the weight of years of uncertainty and grief. Similar messages would follow from Rachel's parents, Emma's brother, and others who had never stopped searching for the truth. Ready to head back? Lieutenant Commander Hayes asked, approaching with a cup of coffee. I took one last look at the coordinates where everything had changed. The sea here was calm now, showing no sign of the drama that had unfolded. But I knew better than most how deceptive calm waters could be. Yes, I said finally. I think this journey is over. As we turned toward shore, I thought about all the lessons Marcus had taught me about the sea. About reading weather patterns, understanding currents, and navigating through dangerous waters. In the end, those same lessons had helped me destroy him. Sometimes the perfect teacher creates their own perfect nemesis. The weeks following Marcus's arrest unfolded like a complex tide, each day bringing new revelations to the surface. The media dubbed him the maritime murderer, though I preferred Sandra's more subtle designation, the deep water widower. The investigation spread across continents, each discovered detail confirming what I'd known that night on the yacht. Marcus's web of deception ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. The preliminary hearing was held in a federal courthouse, overlooking Boston Harbor. I watched from the gallery as Marcus was led in, his designer suit replaced by prison orange, his confident swagger reduced to a shuffling gait. His eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw a flicker of the calculating predator still lurking behind his defeated exterior. The prosecution has identified at least 7 previous victims, the federal prosecutor announced, her voice steady as she laid out the case. Each murder was meticulously planned, each death staged to appear as a tragic maritime accident. The Defendant preyed upon successful, wealthy women, earning their trust before orchestrating their deaths at sea. Marcus's defense team tried to paint him as a grieving widower, a victim of tragic coincidences and circumstantial evidence. But the evidence I'd gathered was irrefutable. The hidden cameras from our anniversary cruise had captured every detail: his careful preparation of the poison, his calculated conversations laying groundwork for my accident, his precise planning of the fatal route. Between court sessions, I met with the families of his previous victims. Catherine Mills's sister clutched my hand as we reviewed the evidence I'd discovered. "We knew something was wrong," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. Katie was too experienced a sailor for that kind of accident, but he had an answer for everything. Rachel Anderson's parents shared photos of their daughter, vibrant, successful, wearing the same sapphire ring that had later adorned my finger. "She called the night before that last cruise," her mother recalled. "Said she had something important to tell us when she got back. We never got to hear what it was." Emma Chen's brother flew in from Singapore, bringing with him additional evidence they'd discovered after her death, but had been unable to prove significant. "The local authorities ruled it an accident," he explained, his accent thick with emotion. "Said these things happen at sea, but Emma grew up on boats. She knew every safety protocol by heart." The investigation expanded as more victims were identified. Sarah Blackwood, his first known wife, had vanished during a sailing trip off the coast of Maine in 2010. Jennifer Torres disappeared 2 years later near the Florida Keys. Each case followed the same pattern: a whirlwind romance, a seemingly perfect marriage, and a tragic accident at sea that left no trace of the victim. "He evolved over time," Sandra explained during a strategy session with the prosecution team. "Each murder taught him something new, helped him refine his technique." She spread out a timeline showing his progression. By the time he targeted Victoria, he had it down to an art form. The evidence from my hidden cameras proved crucial. They captured Marcus in unguarded moments, revealing the calculated nature of his preparations. One particularly damning clip showed him practicing his grief-stricken performance in our yacht's cabin mirror, rehearsing the story he would tell about my tragic accident. "The defendant didn't just murder these women," the prosecutor told the grand jury. "He stole their stories, their futures, their very identities. He turned their love of the sea against them, using their passion for sailing as the instrument of their deaths." The yacht itself became a floating crime scene, every inch examined for evidence of previous crimes. Forensic teams discovered trace evidence linking it to Emma's disappearance, a hidden compartment containing her personal effects that Marcus had kept as trophies. Like many predators, he couldn't resist keeping mementos of his victims. During the investigation, I continued my work at the museum, finding solace in the preservation of maritime history. The irony wasn't lost on me: how my professional skills in authenticating artifacts had helped me unravel Marcus's web of fake documentation and false identities. "You've created quite a ripple effect," Lieutenant Commander Hayes commented during one of our follow-up interviews. "Cold cases across 3 continents are being reopened. Other suspicious maritime accidents are being reinvestigated." The evidence I'd gathered sparked changes in maritime law enforcement. New protocols were established for investigating accidents at sea, particularly those involving wealthy couples. Insurance companies revised their policies regarding maritime death benefits, adding extra layers of scrutiny to claims involving disappeared spouses. Marcus's network of accomplices began to crumble. James Crawford, the fake best friend who had helped establish Marcus's false background, turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. His testimony revealed the intricate planning that went into each murder, how Marcus would study his targets for months, crafting the perfect persona to attract each specific woman. "He had files on all of them," James testified, unable to meet my gaze across the courtroom. Detailed dossiers on their interests, their habits, their finances. He could become whatever they were looking for: the sophisticated collector for Victoria, the adventurous sailor for Rachel, the conservative businessman for Catherine. The financial investigation uncovered accounts in tax havens around the world, each containing millions in life insurance payouts and transferred assets. Marcus had built a fortune on the deaths of trusting women, using each payout to fund his next elaborate performance. One afternoon, as I left the courthouse, I found Catherine's sister waiting by my car. "I brought you something," she said, holding out a small box. Inside was a delicate silver compass on a chain. It was Katie's. She always said it would help her find her way home. Her eyes met mine, bright with tears. She did find her way home, through you. They all did. That night, I stood at the harbor's edge, watching the waves catch the last light of day. The compass hung heavy around my neck, a reminder of all the women who had loved the sea, only to have that love turned against them. Marcus had tried to use the ocean's power to hide his crimes, but in the end, the truth had surfaced, carried back to shore on tides of justice. The preliminary hearings concluded with Marcus being held without bail, deemed both a flight risk and a danger to society. As they led him from the courtroom, he turned to me one last time. "You took everything from me," he snarled, mask finally stripped away completely. "No, Marcus," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I just made sure you couldn't take anything. More from anyone else. The sea keeps its secrets," he had always said. But sometimes, with enough patience and courage, those secrets find their way back to the light, carried on waves of truth and justice that not even the most careful predator can hold back. 6 months after our fateful anniversary cruise, I stood in a different courtroom to witness Marcus's sentencing. The trial had been shorter than expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and testimony from his surviving victims' families, he had finally accepted a plea deal. 7 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of parole. 1 life term for each woman whose life he had stolen. The judge's voice echoed through the hushed courtroom as she delivered her final remarks. "Mr. Sterling, or whatever your real name might be, you turned the beauty of the sea into a weapon, love into a trap, and trust into a tool of destruction. The depth of your crimes matches the waters you used to hide them. Marcus sat motionless as the sentence was read, his perfect posture finally broken. The sophisticated sailor, the wealthy collector, the devoted husband, all his carefully crafted personas had crumbled away, leaving only the hollow shell of a predator who had finally met his match. When given the chance to speak, he turned to face me one last time. "You think you've won," he said, his voice carrying that familiar hint of charm even now. "But you've become just like me, a perfect student, using everything I taught you." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Marcus. I used what you taught me to protect others, not to destroy them. That's the difference between us. One you never understood." The victims' families filled 3 rows of the gallery. Catherine's sister wore her compass around her neck. Rachel's mother clutched a photo of her daughter. Emma's brother held her old sailing logbook. Each carried something to remember their loved ones by, each finally able to close a chapter that had been left painfully open. After the sentencing, Sandra met me outside the courthouse. "The investigation is still expanding," she reported. "They've identified 2 more possible victims from the 90s. Marcus Sterling wasn't even his first identity." I wasn't surprised. Like the ocean itself, the full depth of his crimes might never be fully known. But at least he wouldn't be able to add any more victims to his list. The media circus eventually died down. The books and documentaries would come later. The Perfect Storm, Inside the Maritime Murderer Case, and Deep Water Lies both became bestsellers. I declined all interview requests, preferring to let the evidence and court records tell the story. I sold the waterfront house and the yacht, donating the proceeds to a foundation established in memory of Marcus's victims. The Maritime Safety and Survival Fund would go on to help develop better tracking systems for private vessels and support families of those lost at sea. The museum granted me a sabbatical, which I used to help other women learn about maritime safety and self-defense. The sea isn't just for predators, I would tell them. It's for survivors, too. 1 year to the day after that fatal anniversary cruise, I returned to the sea. Not on a luxury yacht this time, but on a small research vessel helping to track migration patterns in the Caribbean. The ocean had been my first love, long before Marcus, and I refused to let him taint that relationship. Catherine's sister joined me on some of these expeditions. Katie would have loved this, she said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the waves in gold. Using the sea to help others, to learn, to heal. The compass she had given me hung in the ship's cabin, its arrow always pointing true north. Like the women it represented, it had survived dark waters to help guide others home. I kept in touch with the families, bound together by a tragic connection, but united in healing. We created a memorial garden at the Maritime Museum, each victim represented by their favorite flowers. Rachel's roses, Emma's lilies, Catherine's wildflowers, all thriving in the salt air, their beauty a testament to lives that refuse to be forgotten. Marcus's case led to changes in maritime law and safety regulations. Insurance companies now required more rigorous investigations of accidents at sea. Coast Guard protocols were updated to include more thorough searches in cases of missing persons. Each change represented another layer of protection for future potential victims. The evidence I'd gathered became a case study in maritime law enforcement training. Lieutenant Commander Hayes occasionally invited me to speak at Coast Guard seminars, sharing my experience to help others recognize the signs we had all missed. The sea keeps its secrets, I would tell them, but it also reveals truth to those who know how to look for it. Sandra continued her work, specializing in maritime insurance, fraud, and missing persons cases. "You changed the game," she told me over coffee one day. "Predators like Marcus can't operate the same way anymore. The water's not deep enough to hide their tracks." The nightmares eventually faded, replaced by dreams of open water and endless horizons. I learned to love the sea again, not as an escape or a weapon, but as a force of nature that demanded respect and offered healing in return. My last act regarding Marcus was to return all the family heirlooms to their rightful owners' families. The sapphire ring went back to Rachel's parents. The emerald necklace was restored to Emma's sister. Catherine's brother received the antique locket. Each piece carried a history of love and loss, now transformed into symbols of remembrance and justice. As I write this from my new home overlooking a different harbor, I think about all the lessons learned from my journey through treacherous waters. Marcus taught me about deception and calculation, but the sea taught me about survival and resilience. The ocean, like life itself, can be both beautiful and dangerous. The key is not to fear its depths, but to respect them, to understand them, and sometimes to use them to bring truth to light. To the women who sail these waters after me, may your compass always point true, may your anchors hold firm, and may you recognize the difference between those who love the sea and those who use it to hide their darkness. The water's surface can lie, but the truth always finds its way home. Sometimes love stories end in tragedy. Sometimes they end in justice. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to weather the storm, they end in triumph over those who would turn our deepest waters into hunting grounds. This is one such story. May it help guide others safely to shore.